Welcome to Transform Now, the podcast brought to you by robotic process automation pioneer Blue Prism. Digital transformation has the potential to reshape the way companies service their customers, engage their employees, and manage their operations. Whether you're looking to develop strategies, tactics, and best practices to positively impact the future of work, or you're curious to learn how other companies have successfully navigated their digital transformation programs, then this podcast is for you. We're here to help you transform now.
Hello, everyone. I'm Brad Hairston with Blue Prism. Welcome to the Transform Now podcast. Today, I am excited to have as my guest Mark Settle. Mark is a 7-time CIO, a 3-time CIO 100 award winner, and an author. His most recent book is Truth from the Valley, a practical primer on IT management for the next decade. Mark serves on the advisory boards of several venture capital firms and multiple startup companies. Today, Mark and I will be discussing his thoughts on how organizations are achieving automation at scale. Mark, thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, Brad, I've been looking forward to this.
Excellent. So why don't you start us off with an introduction? Tell us a little bit more about yourself, if you don't mind.
Well, you had mentioned that I am a 7-time CIO. I've worked in a variety of industries. I've worked most recently in the enterprise software space, but I've had prior flirtations, more than a flirtation, engagements in oil and gas industry, financial services, some consumer products. And so I've had the good fortune, actually, of watching information technology practices implemented and various types of technology innovation pursued in different industries, which has been really a fascinating experience for me personally. So that's kind of sums up what I've been up to for the last, I won't tell you how many years.
All right. And Mark, I couldn't help but notice that you have a bachelor's degree from MIT and a PhD from Brown, both in geological science. So how do you get from there to becoming a 7-time career CIO? I'm dying to know.
Well, the simple answer is very early in my career, I went to work in the oil and gas industry. I was with Arco Oil and Gas, which was subsequently purchased by British Petroleum. And you could argue that really oil and gas companies are just big technology companies. We always had deep pockets, no matter whether the industry was up or down, to invest in the most state-of-the-art computer equipment possible. So I tell people I sort of got a master's degree in computer science during the time that I worked for Arco. I was there for about 10 years, and I worked in their research lab, which at the time was on the north side of Dallas. So we were doing some pretty sophisticated things.
Yeah. So, Mark, you are one of the first career CIOs that I've been able to interview on our podcast. So I'm definitely eager to get your perspective on a number of topics within the world of intelligent automation. Let's start here. How do you think most CIOs view robotic process automation?
So I'm going to give you a somewhat complicated answer to that question. So I think there's one perspective of looking in their own function within the IT function itself and challenging themselves, what can RPA do for me? And automation has a skill set that's been around for a long time in IT. People look for ways of automating patching and updating procedures in data centers, servicing customers, internal clients and employees that call into the service desk, requesting a new laptop or reporting some kind of a service incident, or even automating the daily upload of new application information into the company's data warehouse for operational reporting purposes. So automation is really kind of just a normal part of the way IT goes about doing its own business. And I think most CIOs would say if they look at the RPA toolset in terms of their own needs, it's just another tool in the quiver. It's one way of maybe resolving some problems or addressing some opportunities they've had in the past. But it's not like some kind of a seminal seismic event which displaces or transcends all the other tools that they've used in the past. On the business side, it's a sort of a different perspective. And I think most CIOs would readily admit the RPA tools, they hold tremendous promise for all the reasons that most of your listeners are well aware of. But I think they'd also have this kind of undercurrent feeling that it's just quite possible that the business leaders don't really understand the complexities of implementing a new technology like that, what some of the longer term implications are. So I'm going to use the term leery. I think if the business leaders who became enamored with RPA tools, arrived on their doorstep, but they try to maybe kind of talk down their enthusiasm a notch or two to just make sure they can understand what some of the implications are on more of a long-term basis.
Interesting. In your experience, has someone from the business typically sponsored intelligent automation into an organization, or have you seen the IT function play a more prominent role in that?
So I think the IT leaders, they can always be kind of the bearer of the message, if you will, or maybe like the canary in the coal mine that says, not that it's a disaster, but like, hey, we're onto something here. I've talked to my other CIO peers at some other companies. They're seeing some really great business results. We really, do you want to partner with me, the CIO, and run some kind of a proof of concept or do some prototyping with this tool because we're, hearing such great things. But I don't think the IT people would necessarily be the lead in this area. A good analogy might be, say, for example, we were in a growing company and we had purchased an HR system, a human resources management system that was very appropriate for a small to medium-sized business. And we were outgrowing that particular platform. And we wanted something maybe, bigger, more sophisticated, and all the bells and whistles, because now suddenly we're operating internationally and we have human relations issues and pay and benefits issues all around the world. And so it might be time to upgrade to an Oracle HR system or a Workday kind of a system. And typically it would be the business that would encounter the pain points associated with the smaller scale solution that was currently in place that would come to IT and say, we need to work together about issues in terms of bringing a new platform and connecting it to all the other systems and securing it and making sure it complies with whatever regulatory constraints we operate on within our industry, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
And so if you look at any kind of an ERP project for sure, or any other large initiative like a new data warehousing capability, et cetera, it's very, very common for there to be a business lead on the project and an IT lead on the project because they kind of can't do one without the other. Neither one is independently capable of getting the kind of benefits that they're pursuing. And so RPA, I think, falls into that same category. So I would suspect more often than not, the initial spark plug, the idea, the catalyst kind of comes from the business side. They've seen something there that they think really has benefit for them, or they've reached a pain point that's so painful that they're ready to try something new that they've never done before, which could be RPA. And then they come to IT to kind of sort out how we're going to actually implement this thing.
Right. Okay. Touching on something you said just a second ago, how do CIOs feel in general about the idea of enabling the business to do more automation by themselves, whether that's through RPA or other no-code platforms versus depending upon IT to do it?
So that's a great question, Brad. I think the general perception would be after some experience. I don't know if people are usually sufficiently enlightened at the outset, but as you start to use the tools, you realize there's certainly situations where IT oversight or involvement or approval or support is more of a hindrance than a help. And so perhaps I learn how to build a bot for myself. And perhaps sometime on a daily or weekly basis, I'm expected to pull some data together to file a report to send to my boss. Perhaps there's some kind of a data quality procedure that I'm personally responsible for executing on a daily basis. I don't know. We could make up examples. And so I build a bot. It does exactly what I would have done in those situations, depending on what it touches and the kind of data it handles, et cetera. It's quite possible that IT adds no value whatsoever getting involved in that particular construction project. It's me and my screen, and I've come up with a way of automating some of the things that I would have done on a regular basis. Again, whether it's daily or weekly or monthly. On the other hand, there would be other kinds of things that I could construct that could have implications from like a SOX perspective, like I'm moving data which could in some ways impair our SOX compliance, or there's some master data management issues involved. I'm kind of redefining billing addresses somewhere, or copying the wrong billing address into a system of record, or something of that nature. And so if it's going to be unattended, kind of operate on a regular basis and touch I hate to use the term sensitive. It's not, let's say business critical information. Then IT, I think most IT leaders would say, we need to get involved in the process at some level. Maybe it's a one-time sort of a check just to make sure this is fine. Maybe it's something we need to look at on a regular basis. Maybe it's something that has been developed in one department that can be actually used more broadly across the enterprise. And so can we partner with the finance guys that built this thing and make some slight modifications and maybe either use it elsewhere in the corporation or have it deployed in other divisions or lines of business instead of the one in which it was originally invented. So it's those kind of considerations, I think, that lead IT to become more involved. But I guess the terminology I would end with on this question is rules of engagement. So until you have some real-world experience using the tools, any kind of rules of engagement that you'd come up with would be largely theoretical. But once you've gotten a certain amount of experience under your belt, I think then it's time to kind of sit down and say, how do we want to do this in the future so you, the business, can get the maximum benefit out of this tool without having to come over and get us involved. And conversely, we don't want to waste our time helping review and check off some kind of bot that's running around doing a very routine thing that involves, very routine data. It's a very routine process. It's something that IT can add no value.
Yeah. Something else I've been dying to ask a CIO or a former CIO about, most companies that embrace automation will put a center of excellence in place to govern it, to sustain it, to scale it. And it's very common for that COE to be situated within IT. Mark, is that the best place for the COE, in your opinion?
No.
Ooh,
now,
okay.
it might be that IT needs to be the midwife, so to speak, to start the COE. But the COE needs to belong in some form of white space in the org chart. It needs to find a demilitarized zone for a couple of reasons. IT will naturally gravitate towards more oversight and control because that's, whether we all like to admit it or not, it's part of IT's responsibilities. That's other people write policies, and IT kind of gets stuck with the dirty work of enforcing security and enforcing SOX compliance and enforcing master data management, et cetera. But the other reason that doesn't get talked about as much, why you need the demilitarized zone, I've seen many examples of companies where an RPA tool has been brought into the finance team, and the finance team has no interest whatsoever in sharing it with any other functional group in the company. They effectively, they don't provide any mechanism to spread the expertise that they've developed.
Right.
And in many cases, they would actually discourage it because they're smart enough to realize, well, gee, once this gets used in marketing, and then once it gets used in sales, and once it gets used in HR, we're going to kind of lose control of this thing, and new rules will pop up, and suddenly it's not going to be our little hobby toy that we get to play with. And this isn't unique to RPA. This happens a lot of times with other tools that come in to a company. And so I think you need to really kind of find a demilitarized zone. There are companies that have a chief automation officer title, and those people kind of wander around in some white space. I think those organizations can be pretty fluid. They might report to a COO one day. They might report to a CIO on another day. They might report to CEO if it was a big enough initiative. So no, I don't think on a long-term basis you really want the COE to be in IT. It's not the best. But again, it might be absolutely essential to do that at the outset, because if you just let 1,000 flowers bloom and think that somehow it's going to provide these enterprise-wide business benefits, I think you'd be fooling yourself.
Right. Mark, what is the most important thing a CIO can do to ensure an organization achieves its objectives for intelligent automation?
So I'm going to surprise you with the answer to this one. It's to help the company determine how they're going to measure the value, to come up with the appropriate value realization metrics.
Yeah.
And there'll inevitably be a ton of anecdotal good news, like, oh my goodness, we've used to do 100 of these a week. Now we can do 150. Or we gave Sally and Jim back an hour per day. They don't have to do this anymore. Well, that's all great, but can you translate those advances in efficiency into capabilities or outcomes that reflect business value that would be universally agreed upon within that senior executive team? Or is it just a bunch of anecdotal happy news that's kind of being shared? So the programs I've seen that have become really strategic on an enterprise-wide basis, it's pretty crystal clear how they're going to measure things. And it's not always cost. Everybody thinks it's a cost takeout kind of an exercise. Nothing could be farther from the truth, I think, as people become more adept at this. It might, in a regulated industry, if there are certain processes that can be automated and done on a consistent basis, no human error, and frankly, no manipulation on the part of intentional manipulation on the part of human beings, that can be a big payoff. Whatever those motivations are, that's important. The other terminology I've seen used by some people who are really leaders in this field is the so-called North Star. So if the whole management team, and I'm talking about the executives here, can agree like this is why we're doing this, it could be to provide a not even best in class, like an industry-setting level of customer experience. We are going to, every customer interaction will employ automation tools to be the most intuitive, frictionless, personalized experience that you can ever have in XYZ, buying a car, buying a house, taking out a loan, doing whatever. Then it becomes really easy to start figuring out, like, how are we going to prioritize individual projects? Are we going to measure, maybe we measured like the time it takes to get a loan application approved. And if we can chisel that down from 2 weeks to 2 days to 2 hours to 2 minutes, that's kind of our value realization metric. And so everybody can see how things are converging towards that kind of an outcome. So I think that's, IT people, again, have been in these kind of big projects many times, trying to justify investments in new technology in terms of what the business outcomes are going to be. And I think they can, again, play a role here in that kind of midwife function to try to promote and facilitate that conversation among the execs of how we're going to measure this. And also, however that gets done, whether it's in the IT function or outside, mechanisms need to be put in place to provide some regular progress reports on how we're doing towards either that North Star overarching goal, or maybe it's more than one kind of value realization metric that we're pursuing.
Mark, let's turn our attention to the topic of automation at scale. You said in a recent article that automation at scale is achieved when automation, data analytics, and machine learning tools are used in concert to perform a wide variety of corporate activities efficiently and effectively. Can you explain your point of view here?
Sure. I think a lot of the initial experiments and projects with automation tools, they obviously look for the so-called low-hanging fruit opportunities where certain practices or processes are very rule-based, high frequency, very repetitive, and you can kind of knock those off pretty quickly and generate some early wins for the initiative. As you start to branch out and you get into bigger processes, maybe that are cross-functional, that are more complex, as you well know, Brad, you get into situations where you have to make some kind of like a risk-based decision. So you get from point A to point B to point C to point D. Now, point D, you've got a couple of possibilities. You could go to E, you might skip to M, or you might default to Q. And all three of those paths have been employed in the past at this particular junction point. And in many cases, there's data available to predict what the probability of the outcomes are if you go down either one of the three alternatives that you're facing at that particular juncture. And so what would normally happen is a human being would, kind of weigh those different factors and then make the call and say, well, I can't guarantee this is going to have the outcome that I'm looking for, but it has some balance between the highest potential benefit and the lowest risk exposure. And so that's a decision gets made. And of course, over time, what happens is business conditions change, and maybe the default to M, the M path, that was the right thing to do 6 months ago or during the Christmas shopping season or on the early stages of the pandemic is now the wrong one. Maybe the risk is higher there, the benefits are somewhat more questionable, and now it's time to default to the Q option. And you would be able to see that in the data that you had available, and you would take your AI or machine learning model and adapt it to the changes in data. So that's what I mean by that. I don't want to say that you necessarily run out of steam, but simple stuff, the rule-based, repetitive processes of fairly limited scope, you can produce some benefits around that. Inevitably, as programs mature over time, they're going to want to take on some of the bigger opportunities that are out there. And the bigger opportunities are, guess what? Cross-functional, more ambiguous, involve a whole lot more human intuition and judgment. And these other capabilities that we're talking about, the analytics and the AI, are really the way to be able to move to that next level of maturity.
Right. Mark, what do you believe are the key success factors for automating at scale?
So it's very important to have a robust opportunity pipeline. You need a portfolio of projects. Some opportunities will always be relatively more tractable, maybe easier to implement. Definitely some kind of an initiative that's being performed in a single function is by definition going to be easier to accomplish than one that involves different points of view of people coming in from multiple functions.
Right.
And you kind of, if I'm running the program, I'll make it personal. I don't want to roll the dice on a bunch of big sequential bets, because if one of them doesn't pan out, the whole program can kind of get kind of tinged with bad reputation. I want to have a portfolio of opportunities. Like, you don't see too many oil and gas companies, if to go back to early days of my career, that kind of run the company. Let's go drill one well at a time, report the results, and that's how we're going to build this company. No, they're drilling hundreds of wells, and if they're lucky, 1 out of 500 is going to make the company for the next 10 years. So it's that same kind of thing, to have a portfolio of those kind of opportunities. That's super important. I always tell people you should lean into staffing and the new skills you need as soon as possible. The skills are very limited, and I know many, many other CIOs that I talk to that are involved in these initiatives complain that the consulting firms that they're using, they cost a lot of money and they stay around a long time just because they don't have the internal staff, the expertise that they need. And yes, you can retrain some people, et cetera, but in many ways it is some fundamentally new skills and ways of thinking about things. And so that's important. We touched on the realization metrics. And then to get to the at-scale opportunity that's out there, the real breakthroughs tend to come when people are willing to think about re-engineering an existing process. And again, I've talked to many people in these leadership roles, and it's human nature, right? Brad, you and I would have the same experience. If somebody comes into the way I'm performing my job or the way our team is operating, we kind of think about improvement in terms of 10% better efficiency or more effectiveness, or 15 or 20 or, my Lord, even 25%. And we never kind of think about, well, what if we blew up the whole thing? It's like the loan application process I just talked about. The people who it takes 2 weeks, they've spent the last 20 years of their life getting it down to 2 weeks, and they think that's really good. And you show up on their doorstep and say, oh, we're going to go to 2 hours. Definitely can get this thing knocked out in 2 hours. It shouldn't take 2 weeks. They think you're from Pluto, that you're a different life form. They can't even comprehend what that would be like. And so what really frustrates people leading the automation programs is they can see that vision. They can't always motivate the business, not the leaders, but also the practitioners down in the trenches in these functions to kind of shake off the way that they've always done business and really think about some much more fundamental things. And that's also kind of where the North Star concept comes in. So when I used that one idea before, we're going to optimize that customer experience. Well, if that's the North Star, then I think you can challenge yourself and your peers. Let's really think through whether we want to just build some kind of routine that automates what we do now slightly better, or do we really want to just kind of take it all apart and put it back together in some new way that would lead to some really fundamentally new results or benefits to so opportunity pipeline, staffing up in the right skills, getting the value realization metrics in place, and then a willingness to re-engineer existing processes. If you can put that together, I think that's a real formula for implementing automation at scale.
With regard to upgrading skills, what are your thoughts on citizen development and the impact that it can have on automation at scale?
Citizen developer programs are extremely important because IT will never have the staffing, and the functional operations teams that frequently are responsible for the use of this technology in their functional areas will never have the bandwidth to really address the spectrum of opportunities that are out there. So absolutely, you need to enlist the aid of as many employees as possible. They will have lots of creative ideas about ways they can get their job done more efficiently, or their team's responsibilities executed more efficiently. I don't really have a good prescriptive approach to implementing this. It's a force multiplier that's an absolute essential requirement to get the full benefit from the technology, but it is undoubtedly kind of one of the messiest things to try to set up and run. I'm a big proponent of certification programs, so there's some kind of formalism associated with individuals who've been selected to go through, I don't mean like stop their normal jobs, but there's some set of training modules and tests, and they check off things that say like, okay, you understand how to use this appropriately. We're going to kind of turn you loose. But they're an essential element of any successful program. One of the hardest ones to actually put in place. And that's where, if you go back to the conversation we had a little bit earlier here about rules of engagement, you really want to have some rules of engagement, like a enterprise-wide certification program, and you really try to start recruiting the Army that's going to go out and use the tools, because there's just way too many ways the frustration can build up between the oversight that an IT group is going to provide for the reasons we talked about before, and the ambitions that individuals will have out in the business. I don't know if I'd raise my hand and say, oh yeah, let me lead the charge. I want to go out there and run that citizen developer program, but they're very important.
It's just really good to hear your perspective on that as a former CIO, because we certainly are seeing it a lot across our customer base. And we've also seen how it can really have a very positive impact on scaling if it's treated the right way, as you said, and managed and governed and not just allowed to run on its own.
The other thing, Brad, I really didn't touch on is the supporting resources that people need. That has to be structured in some way, whether it's documentation, whether people that are in the COE are earmarked to spend 20% of their time to be kind of a support team to this citizen developers. But the antithesis of what I'm talking about, which unfortunately exists in many companies, it's like, just go do it on your own and don't come bother us. There's stuff online you can read, and if you get in a bind, give us a call, and if we have a little time and you're a buddy of mine, yeah, I can help you out a little bit, but there's no structure to providing the support that people need. And those programs they'll fail of their own weight without that kind of support.
Mark, do you think automation at scale can create competitive advantage for companies?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Well, in the two most common ways, I think, are the cost takeout that can occur.
Yep.
I will tell you a funny story, though. I was talking to a gentleman, and I was actually trying to solicit him to come join a working group on automation that I was putting together. This is last year. And he's working in a large company, and so I was trying to sign him up to become a member of the committee. So he said, well, when I first came here 2 years ago, we had achieved about $10 million in annual savings. He said, we kind of put the program together, and he said, we're up to about $120 million now in annual savings. And then he started to proceed to tell me like how they had done that. And I said, to this guy, Joe, I said, Joe, you had me at 120 million. Like, you don't have to tell me how. Like, I want you on the committee. Okay. It's like, absolutely, you'd be great. He said, no, you don't understand. They want me to find $1.5 billion over 3 years. I'm only 10% of the way to my target. So that's the one. That's the one side of things. And then on the other side, around customer experience, there's some mind-blowing automation opportunities that are out there. I think it's pretty well established within the healthcare industry that there's enough information that's collected during most doctor office visits that if it was processed in the proper way, you and I would never have to file a claim, an insurance claim.
Yeah.
It all could be done automatically. Like, by the time you came back from the doctor, the money would be in the bank. That's actually feasible. I don't know if it's for like every treatment or therapy that's out there, but there are definitely many situations where that could actually happen.
Yeah.
You might run into some data problems along the way, but in theory it's possible. So that's another case where, I mean, the competitive advantage to an insurance company to be able to say, it's basically touch-free claims. Go use your healthcare policy and you'll be properly treated. You don't have to file all that information. So yes, I think on both of those dimensions, the cost savings and the employee experience, clearly there are opportunities to become the competitive leader within your industry, for sure.
So, Mark, you're advising a number of startup companies in this season of your career. As those companies are getting established and they're figuring out how they're going to build this, sustainable business model, how are those companies looking at intelligent automation? I'd love to get your viewpoint on that as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. So obviously, an older established company is looking at automation inevitably as a way to achieve certain levels of efficiency that can get translated into cost savings or improved profitability, etc. And in startup company land, profitability is like a distant objective. It's all about growth. And so what automation does is effectively avoid future costs, right? So the two dimensions, I think, in which startups, and when I say small companies, I'm talking about companies from 20 people, not that they would have much of an automation program, maybe up to like 2,000 or maybe even like 3,000 or so. So on the one hand, it would be looked as a hedge against recruiting challenges. So as you know, there's a huge war for talent that's going on, especially in the tech industry right now, which is where I do my advising.
Right.
And everybody's trying to go find people to hire. So things that make people more effective or efficient and get, more productivity out of the existing staff or the newly recruited staff, that's super important. The other interesting phenomenon that you have in the startup companies is because you're hiring so quickly, at the end of any given year, a third of the people in the company may have only worked for the company for less than a year. That's not an uncommon situation. And of course, that third of the total workforce, they've all come in from other companies where they all did things differently. And so one of the opportunities with automation is it can provide a degree of, and consistency in the way processes are actually executed. We can all look at each other and say, okay, like we processed invoices 10 different ways in the 30 different companies we all came from. But let's decide here with our current level of business and scope of business and customer complexity, et cetera, let's do invoice processing with these 17 steps. And let's just all agree that, I don't know, any invoice less than XYZ, we're going to do this on a no-touch basis and it'll follow this procedure. Everybody says, yay and verily, let's do that. And in the absence of that, getting to that same level of process consistency with the people that are involved in the function might never be achieved, or it might be kind of a long haul over a multi-month period. So I think in terms of process rigor, definition, you've got to define the process. That's the other thing that happens in these companies is there's not a standard definition of how we're going to do things, and you kind of lurch from a lot of one-of situations. And so the automation tools and approach requires you to set down, like, how are we going to do this? And then obviously it provides a way of executing consistently in the future.
Interesting. So, Mark, one last question for you. In October of last year, you wrote a white paper that predicted a large-scale consolidation of the automation market. And it seems that you were quite the prognosticator, as there truly has been a lot of M&A activity over the past year. Have you been surprised by any of the consolidation moves that have occurred to date?
No, what you're referring to and what I described in the paper, many of the RPA vendors have invested in process mining tools. Many of the low-code, no-code people have made forays into API management or API integration capabilities. RPA vendors have reached out and done something similar in some cases. So all of the core categories, if you will, the core automation categories are to a degree converging. Sure, I'll take this opportunity to pat myself on the back and say I'm not surprised. It's all following my master plan. Okay, so that's good. Maybe more interesting to the audience is to think about, like, what happens next. And it's interesting that as many of the larger automation platform players consolidate and become multifunctional. So they have the integration capabilities, the API integration capabilities. They have the low-code, no-code interfaces that you can use. They have some inherent process mining capabilities, and they have the bot building capabilities as well. So they become these genericized platforms. So while all that's going on, there's a ton of VC investment, venture capital investment that's being poured into automation tools that have the same capabilities but are offering solutions that are purpose-built for a specific industry, like
Right.
financial services or healthcare, or for a particular activity, which again could be like invoice processing or supply chain management or logistics. And there's just enough, in both of those cases, there's a use of, say, domain knowledge and domain terminology that makes it easier for those tools to be used in their specific context that they were intended for. And in some cases, they have, some pre-built capabilities. If it's a supply chain optimization platform, then there's certain obvious things that happen in supply chain management that it's easier to kind of mix and match those capabilities. So that's one trend that's happening. And then to circle back to the conversation of data analytics and artificial intelligence, I think you'll see the big platform players increasingly partner with the leaders in those two domains and try to integrate some of their capabilities into the platform in more of a partnership basis. And then what happens in technology is if there's a very positive response from the customer community, then they will organically develop those capabilities themselves. Like a Blue Prism may have its own AI modeling capability that's an integral part of the platform that can be used to build the bots. So we'll see if that happens. So stay on the lookout for both those trends, the purpose-built capabilities and these newly funded platforms for industries or certain generic business activities, and or the incorporation of these data analytics and AI capabilities. So it's a very exciting time from a technology point of view to kind of watch how the automation capabilities are evolving.
No doubt. No doubt. Well, Mark, I told you at the beginning that I haven't had the chance to talk to a career CIO on the podcast. And so it was really special to have you on today. And you did not disappoint. You gave such great perspective on a number of different points about automation and automation at scale, and just the CIO viewpoint in general on a number of different topics. So thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate you sharing your perspective, and be well.
Thanks, Brad. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to Transform Now. For more insightful discussions on digital transformation and more, check out our podcast channel where you'll find all of our previous episodes. To make sure you never miss an episode, subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast player. And if you like what you heard, please leave us a review. For more information about digital transformation and the future of work, check out blueprism.com to learn how Blue Prism's digital workforce is enabling enterprise transformation now.